So, what is the American dream? You might picture within the American imaginary, which is defined by home ownership, white picket fences, and a family with the traditional roles of the mother, father, daughter, and son alongside a faithful dog. This interpretation is not necessarily wrong, but it is more of the final evaluation. Final evaluation in the sense that it is the American dream for those existing in the American reality, mainly people who have immigrated here or have been living here already for generations. But what about those who are not here yet? Those about to leap? This particular question opens a very big door to the American dream as it exists in other countries. Because there are so many countries, each one has a slightly different goal in mind when making the trip to the U.S. So in this case, I want to hone it into a particular group of people, Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican diaspora, and the differing interpretations of the American dream within the Puerto Rican context. More specifically, I'll be detailing the fundamental differences between the biggest diaspora, New York Puerto Ricans, otherwise known as Nuyoricans, and the Puerto Ricans still residing in the archipelago. To understand how these two communities differ fundamentally, and in terms of the American dream, we'll be putting Ernesto Quiñones' Bodega Dreams into conversation for the Nuyorican perspective, and Judith Ortiz Kaufer's Meaning of Consuelo for the Puerto Rican perspective. So let's begin with a little bit of historical context. So why did I decide to focus on Puerto Ricans specifically? Puerto Ricans became a part of America's imperial armory of island territories after 1898, joining the likes of Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. After 2 years of rule, the United States passed the Foraker Act of 1900, which established Puerto Rico could have a civilian government alongside a governor and other government officials, as well as a non-voting member of Congress, which is still there, by the way, as of 2024. It also granted the United States the power to issue bonds, essentially loans taken from investors for whatever project the government has in sectors like infrastructure to security. These bonds will be very important for later, very. And moreover, this will all be muddied by the fact that the act permitted the president to be the sole appointee of the governor and its officials. Can you believe that? Both Americans and Puerto Ricans began to ask, well, what are we? Then came the insular cases, as a result, a group of cases that solidified Puerto Rico's territorial status, which would, 1, provide answers, and 2, open up opportunities in favor of both Puerto Ricans and the U.S. government. The insular cases ruled Puerto Rico was a self-governed, unincorporated territory of the U.S. with no clear path to statehood. Side note, this ruling, honestly speaking, seems even more ambiguous to me. Nevertheless, the ruling made it clear that Puerto Ricans were not Americans, in the legal sense at least. Although, as they were only self-governing and not incorporated, this would also mean their honorary Congress members' vote would still not count during congressional hearings. Surprise, surprise. But it is still a territory that remains solidified. Post-insular case, Puerto Ricans were granted, you probably guessed it already, citizenship. One more step to becoming American. And the decision to pass the 1917 Jones-Shafroth Act was a strategic one following the construction of the Panama Canal in 1902, which made the Caribbean Central American region even more important. And as you know, the more important something gets, oil, the more investment and control goes into that sector. Speaking of which, the Jones-Shafroth Act also made bonds triple tax exempt. This would allow the U.S. government, corporations, and foreign, quote-unquote foreign, U.S. entities to get away with a lot in terms of labor, ownership, and expansion. I'm looking at you, pharmaceutical companies. So with newly acquired citizenship, the first wave of Puerto Rican migration began. Many moved to Puerto Rico and the Northeast, where it remains the home to the biggest Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States and the world, with over 1.1 million Puerto Rican residents in the New York metropolitan area as of 2024. With this said, if the first couple of thousand Puerto Ricans left in the 1920s, there's most likely a century's worth of Puerto Rican identifying people in New York today, and still supported by the current figures. The second migration also contributed to the current figures as well. The second wave can be placed between the mid-1940s to mid-1960s. Why, you ask? Operation Bootstrap. Operation Bootstrap was a New Deal-esque development program for Puerto Rico, spearheaded by then-Governor Luis Muñoz Marin in 1944. Puerto Rico, up until that point, hadn't seen too much American corporate imperialism, but Operation Bootstrap laid the coffin out. The plan made the agrarian society into an industrial one that appealed to American companies who sought to manufacture items in the island. And they loved this, of course. Through lower labor-related costs and tax exemptions brought about by the Jones Act, corporations found their new homes in Puerto Rico. With this said, migration was the only option to escape the effects of corporate expansion U.S. companies perpetuated in the island to avoid tax, legally at least. Despite two separate waves of migration and the subsequent rise of pharmaceutical companies and their campaigns regarding sterilization, people remained on the island. The islanders who survived all this have created a new developing identity on the island. On the other hand, those who have left starting in the early 19th century have already begun the establishment of the Puerto Rican identity abroad, especially in New York. The diaspora in New York would herein be referred to as Nuyoricans because they have become so intertwined with the culture of the city that they celebrate even one of the biggest parades in the city itself, the Puerto Rican Day Parade, every June. And it brings up to 1 million people each year. Typically, the Nuyoricans on average have higher incomes in the States in comparison to Islander Puerto Ricans. This was also a main motivation for migrating to the island, by the way. However, the islanders have a more enclosed and historical identity unassociated with their socioeconomic status. This is language, often a huge divide between both groups. The assimilation seen in the United States for Puerto Ricans is much more rapid than that of the people of Puerto Rico itself. Nuyoricans mainly speak English or Spanish or Spanglish, which is born from living between two worlds and two cultures, two identities. However, Puerto Ricans on the island still very much speak Spanish as their main language. Although officially English and Spanish are recognized as the main languages and are spoken a lot within major cities like San Juan, Bayamón, Mayagüez, etc. This is seen through stark differences in the portrayal of both groups, which will be observed promptly. Let's start with the Puerto Ricans, or the quote-unquote originals. As mentioned before, a lot of people did choose to stay on the island despite 1, the crippling debt crisis that followed the migration waves, 2, sterilization campaigns, 3, unemployment due to a shift from an industrial society, and 4, increased higher incomes in the States compared to Puerto Rico, and 5, because why not? I mean, you got your citizenship as an additive of just being a colonized state by the United States. Just kidding, or maybe. Anyways, those who have stayed dealt with their own struggles, whether it be adapting to the changing Puerto Rican culture on the island because of Americans' intervention, or just getting by with the economic crisis. Now, here comes the story of the meaning of Consuelo by Judith Ortiz Cofer. Cofer was a Puerto Rican author who specialized in telling creative stories on the complexity of the Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States, but also made sure to detail life back in Puerto Rico. As a native from Hormiguero, Puerto Rico, she dealt with the intersection of culture, gender, family, and migration as she experienced that herself when moving to Paterson, in New Jersey. This unique background allowed Cofer to tell Consuelo's background in a novel. As the novel takes place in the 1950s, the quote-unquote raw culture of Puerto Rican society is still preserved with only 50 years of American imperialism, and therefore Consuelo's experiences tell of a more family-oriented, Spanish-speaking only Puerto Rican culture that she has to deal with. Likewise, Consuelo also has to deal with gender roles, specifically the impact of patriarchal roles from her father in specific, which reflect the Puerto Rican identity at the time. In one specific moment, Consuelo finds out about her father, Rafael's affairs with other women. Consuelo, however, didn't hear this directly, but rather pieced it together herself by overhearing conversations and connecting the dots during reflection. Let's take a look at Rafael's infidelity first before we get into Consuelo. Rafael's infidelity isn't something explicitly stated, but it is commonly known. It's not something hidden, rather it is a source of shame. Not from him, however, but from Consuelo's mother and the rest of his family. Rafael takes the role of the breadwinner and the person as the head of the household. And in this traditionally, quote-unquote, domineering place in the household, he seeps into his relationship. He seeps into his relationships. The main way he does so is through his infidelity. It can be interpreted as an assertion of his own masculinity and his own power over internal household dynamics. The idea that he is not ashamed, but just secretive, which is clearly not enough, accentuates this very idea. Shame is a direct result of regret, Yet there is no regret because he's convinced his patriarchal position, especially as the only man in the household, provides him leeway for his behavior, and therefore he only protects this image of tradition and not of his internal household. From Consuelo's perspective, the moment she realized her father was unfaithful was the moment she underwent a transition from innocence to adulthood. Innocence is characterized by naivety and obliviousness to the things around us. And even for children, this is especially true in the household. I mean, we can look at ourselves, for example. How much can we recall from our parents' conversations as kids under the age of, let's say, like 13? Not much. And even if we do recall a lot of things, back then we probably wouldn't have understood the situation entirely. Not after our own experiences and perhaps the stumbling upon secrets and intel that we otherwise might have never gotten. And this is precisely what Consuelo witnessed in her household. That challenged what she knew about her own family and prompted her to question the authority and the roles that people in her household played. It was an image-shattering moment that changed, one, the way she viewed the roles of her mother and father, but also herself. Was she to just accept this, or could she really do anything about it? That's the dilemma. Seeing as Consuelo is merely a teenager, this moment might have been the beginning of a nihilistic outlook on Puerto Rican culture. For one, it displayed how secretive and surface level much of the culture can be. In that moment, it also displayed how young children are meant to conform to the older traditional and patriarchal values that are perpetuated in Puerto Rican society. Seeing as none of the adults challenge this, she wonders if she can do much to mitigate this. With this said, her innocence does breed a change in how she handles Puerto Rican culture. From here in, her family paints her as weird for challenging and above all, recognizing that this is wrong. That infidelity is wrong, that culture doesn't go above morality and safety. Yet, the response from her mother and the people around her that gossip reflects that there isn't a desire to change, but rather to continue traditional values on the island. This, in turn, prompts Consuelo to be silent and isolated from telling the truth, because if she did it would be a deep betrayal to the society, which is why she conforms to only sharing that something is wrong, through her subtle breaking of Puerto Rican norms. In this way, Puerto Rican culture on the island, through the meaning of Consuelo, is displayed as traditional. It holds, even in relatively recent times as well, to patriarchal superiority, secrecy, and the concept of being gente decente, or decent people. At the surface level, by perpetuating the culture of shame to anyone but the person who has done the wrong, like we've seen with Rafael, who exemplifies this, and Consuelo, who struggles with this. More broadly, the American dream is shown through the desire to want to break out of these boundaries and search for a limitless and less traditional place to be part of. At the end of the novel, Consuelo leaves Puerto Rico, putting obvious reasons to leave like income and technological advancement aside. It's about breaking out of the cycle to hide things internally and treat family affairs in the best way possible. There's no need to sacrifice the structure of the family for the sake of protecting the patriarch, as seen with Rafael. This is exactly why there's a sort of freedom in this choice to leave. Much like the American dream, that choice and the desire to flee Puerto Rican societal pressures make Puerto Rican islanders see the American dream as more of an escape, cultural struggles than anything else. However, it can be said that Consuelo has a chance to stand up to these same roles that have caused her family so much internal strife and pain. Just like how she stands up to Wilhelm about the rumors relating to her virginity at the end of the novel. There's a potency in regaining authority through femininity. Specifically, Consuelo's ability to reject these values within her society, especially the one of appearing to be gente decente. It liberated her from conforming. Although it's not as black and white. Since we can't say she's fully free from the shackles of tradition. While she does stand up to Wilhelm, she accepts the fragility of her family, given her father's infidelity and Millie's condition. She chooses to accept this rather than to fight it, and in turn finds freedom in seeing creation and foundation around her. By this, I mean the ability to leave and start anew. Take this quote on page 185, where Consuelo says, "The last thing I saw at takeoff was a bit of a green speckled earth, elegant as a jewel resting on blue velvet. Columbus had called the island the nipple of the New World, because it was so lush and fertile. A vision so alluring that the Lord Admiral of the high seas had used the language of seduction to record his first sighting of Rican in his captain's log." This second to last paragraph showcases Consuelo's reminiscence on the home she's known all her life, its history and her departure from it. This interesting mention of Columbus alludes to the concept of new beginnings and of creation, of a new life and a new path for Consuelo. As she physically leaves the island, much like Columbus, she doesn't know what to expect. She has a general idea maybe, but not entirely. What motivates Consuelo is the journey towards a new life, not necessarily one that's better, as there is an air of nihilism that she creates by pointing out the rainy day and the gloominess of her day of departure, again on page 185. But it's a leap of faith that expresses her desire to change, whether hard or easy. This culminates the essence of the American dream to Puerto Ricans on the island, who seek migration or who seek to leave the traditional values in which they're bound by. It's that leap, migration to a foreign land, the subtle gloom of starting over again, but the equally subtle hope of leaving the past. On the other side, we're going to be talking about Nuyoricans now. Moving on to the diaspora, we'll begin to talk about the change of the American dream within recently arrived Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rican migrants began to resonate more with the cultures and customs of New York. As mentioned previously, Puerto Ricans mostly moved to New York during the migration waves, which led to the cultural fissure in the Puerto Rican identity. Nuyoricans, as they're referred to, can be summed up with a mix of Spanglish or English, Bronx, Spanish Harlem, or Brooklyn residents, and is that the desire to further up the American ladder. Nuyoricans strived for racial and ethnic equity, as well as to be seen as people who can succeed in the American landscape. This is where the classic American dream comes in. First and second generation Nuyoricans dealt with the struggles of trying to be seen in spheres of higher education, equal status as humans, as racism was still rampant, and as Americans, assimilated ones. Of course, when in a new place, you don't want to stick out too much, so you assimilate enough to get by with the language and the living conditions. Likewise, you don't truly fully assimilate because you still have those little enclaves that, in certain pockets of the city, which still give a taste of home. To Nuyoricans, that would be the taste of Puerto Rico. Let's take a look at Bodega Dreams by Ernesto Quiñones. The story details the life of Bodega, Willie Bodega, one of the main characters of the story. And before we get into the story itself, I'd like to make a few comments about the origins and the inspirations behind Bodega Dreams. If it wasn't painfully obvious, Bodega Dreams is loosely based off The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Just kidding, I wouldn't say loosely as I don't want to throw that term around. I would say it's heavily inspired by The Great Gatsby. And essentially, to fully understand the story of Bodega Dreams, we have to briefly know the story of The Great Gatsby. So essentially, The Great Gatsby speaks about the unrequited love of the protagonist, Jay Gatsby. Jay Gatsby is in love with Daisy, and now Daisy Buchanan because she had married a rich elite in American society instead of Gatsby, the run-of-the-mill military man who could never compare after abandoning Daisy. Well, he was trying to find a way to fix that. His solution to that was to accrue wealth and become what Daisy seemed to have wanted in a lover, which is, well, power and money. So Jay Gatsby began to throw these luxurious parties in hopes that Daisy would someday come and acknowledge her love for him and somehow get married to him and will have a life. But Jay Gatsby doesn't realize that this isn't going to get him anywhere because the people that surround him in these parties are just there for the mere fact that it's an extravagant party that feeds into the rich, wealthy, aristocratic egos. And it's not a benefit to Gatsby at all because no one gets to really know him. Gatsby's convinced that he's doing his community, the community that Daisy is in specifically, a favor. And that he's going to be one of them, but in reality, he isn't. And he realizes this when he gets shot in the end and betrayed by the people that are supposed to support him. The people in the community don't even mourn him because they don't have a connection with him at all, at the personal level. He was just a fleeting party provider where rich people established the most connection with his parties rather than the person who orchestrated them. Now, with The Great Gatsby out of the way, we know where Ernesto Quiñones' story is headed. It will be a story of unrequited love, trying to revitalize a community, loyalty, and gender dynamics. All with a special twist, of course, a hint of Puerto Ricanness, or a big hint of Puerto Ricanness. In Bodega Dreams, Willie Bodega is a direct parallel to Gatsby as he tries to do a good for his community, but he does it through shady and illicit means, primarily drug selling. Julio Mercado parallels Nick Carraway in the story, which is another main protagonist. He also serves as a narrator and friend of Bodega, who aids him in the affairs of his romantic interest, Vera, the parallel to Daisy in The Great Gatsby, who, you guessed it, only cares about Bodega's money and status. And Nazario, the educated, community-oriented lawyer, holds a secret animosity towards Bodega until he shoots him in cahoots with Vera. And you know who this parallels? Daisy's husband. So, anyway, the parallels are obvious enough. Much of the story plays out the same exact way. Overall, the direct connection between these two texts here exemplifies the values of those assimilating to America, especially in America's social spheres. Looking at the Nuyorican community in particular, Bodega's dedication to making Spanish Harlem an educated, safe, and prosperous place reflects his desire to be like every other thriving community in America. He wants this Puerto Rican community specifically to be all-American and seem like everyone else in New York. But what does it matter if he achieves it through illicit avenues, through easy ones? Now, let's look at a character like Vera in this story. We know she made herself seem a certain way to chase that ideal American life, to climb that social ladder. Vera successfully created the notion to her, quote-unquote, her circle in Miami that she was a Barnard girl, and, quote, with that misleading last name, she would fool anyone into thinking she was some middle-aged Anglo woman, end quote. And as her real name is Veronica, she had morphed herself into something other than where she came from and avoids all acknowledgement of it in order to fit into the rich social sphere in Miami. Vera's ambitions as a Puerto Rican woman in Spanish Harlem was to escape the life associated with Puerto Ricans living there. She did not want to be surrounded by the organized crime or the impoverished neighborhoods and the social customs that bound her from being all-American. All-American within Bodega Dreams is the white Anglo rich careless life that we see Vera's friend a part of. It's not a textbook definition of the white picket fence, house-owning, typical four-person family stereotype we've seen thrown around, but it displays the pattern of wanting to climb the social ladder instead of working for the elevation of the community itself that she was a part of. However, the biggest identifiers for the Nuyorican community through the novel was at the very end, where Chino details Bodega's transformation of Spanish Harlem. And Chino refers to Julio Mercado. And he details Bodega's transformation of Spanish Harlem as successful despite his death. No one credited Bodega's work, however, more so his death, for bringing this revitalization to Spanish Harlem. His death alongside Nazario and Vera's exits effectively pushed negativity, old ties, and animosity from the community and converted it into the next step to change. This change, and quote, a new language that means a new race. This change, as described by Mercado, quote, a new language means a new race. Spanglish is the future. It's a new language being born out of the ashes of two cultures clashing with each other. You will use this new language, words they might not teach you in that college. Words that aren't English and Spanish, but at the same time are both, end quote. If there isn't a better quote to define Nuyoricans, I don't know what quote could ever truly encapsulate them. One of the most defining traits of Nuyoricans, as exemplified by this quote, is their ability to speak an entirely new language, unlocked by the assimilation of earlier, purposeful, like Vera's, or unpurposeful, like the Puerto Rican lady observed by Chino. It's a reminder that Nuyoricans are kind of not Puerto Ricans in the entire cultural sense, but they still are because they implement and expand upon their roots in New York City. Language, in general, has always been the defining feature of assimilated cultures. Whether it be through colonization, migration, or a natural shift in linguistics, the language you speak tells a history, but it also tells a story. This is certainly true with Bodega Dreams. The entirety of the novel follows the developments of Bodega's plans as they fail yet succeed, as history is overwritten by a new present, by that cultural shift we see through the language, in a way that's also the manner in which Puerto Ricans and Nuyoricans differ. While Puerto Ricans acquired Spanish through colonization and made it their primary language, also synonymous with their culture up until today, Nuyoricans, it represents the past. A sole Spanish diaspora wouldn't be representative of that cultural shift in New York, and even if there were efforts to preserve Puerto Rican Spanish, it would simply not survive. Assimilation, in the Nuyorican sense, serves as the defining function of Nuyoricans because they use Spanglish to partially let go of Puerto Rico and make room for the United States, where they must grasp the realities of trying to make a society that benefits them more as a community, just like Bodega set out to do so. With all this in place, the cultural fissure between Nuyoricans and Puerto Ricans is undeniable. Mainly through Spanglish and traditional values, we can see how it might be slightly difficult to place both identities into a single sphere. Well, actually, not really. It's not that significant of a divide to make them like strangers to each other. A Spanglish-speaking Nuyorican can still be understood by a Puerto Rican, and traditional Puerto Rican values might not be as such a foreign concept to Nuyoricans, who still hold on to some familial customs that they bring with them. It's not fair to separate both identities completely. That's not the point. The point is to notice the difference and explain their split. After all, at the semantic level, they still share even the word Rican. How different could that really make them? With this in mind, the meaning of Consuelo really highlighted the nuances of these differences. It's not just traditional values. It's patriarchy, femininity, the concept of being a decent person or gente decente, and Bodega Dreams that highlights Nuyorican culture as upward mobility, community, and Spanglish. Again, the meaning of Consuelo makes the American dream to be off opportunity, travel, and freedom. In contrast, Bodega Dreams makes it to be upward mobility and opportunity. In contrast, Bodega Dream makes it about upward mobility and acceptance within the greater American society. And in these contrasting dreams, both texts come together to share the story of moving from the past, taking a leap towards the future for something other than the status quo in the Puerto Rican community, as it should be the way to go. All this exemplified through Bodega and Consuelo, two ambitious, unconventional people that elevate the meaning of what being Nuyorican and Puerto Rican really is.